So, we are continuing our mountain moving series during this season of Lent. Pastor Joe started us off last week talking about how Jesus is the mountain man. And I tell you, ever since Joe said that, I keep thinking about Jesus as some kind of lumberjack, so I can't get it out of my head. Jesus is the mountain man. He can move mountains. Our key verse comes from the parable of the mustard seed, where the disciples fail to cast out a demon, and they ask Jesus, why couldn't we cast out this demon? And Jesus goes on to tell them that they must have faith like a mustard seed. And a part of what Joe was pointing out last week, I think, is that our faith is not a faith in our power or a faith in our own belief, but it is simply a faith in Jesus. And I think Peter shows us kind of the difference. When Jesus tells Peter that he's going to deny him 3 times, Peter says, "No, Lord, I'm not going to deny you 3 times." And I think that's the perfect example of what we're kind of diving into, which was Peter had more faith in his own faith than he did in Jesus himself. And that's why he denied his words and instead believed that he was going to be faithful. So today, and in the rest of the series, we're going to be focusing on the real mountain mover. Not us by our own faith, but by Jesus, who is faithful, as he is the mountain mover. So we're going to learn a little bit more about Jesus, the mountain mover. Today we're going to be reading what is referred to as the story of the Gerasene Demoniac. This story is recorded in all of the synoptic gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but we're going to be reading the witness recorded in Luke. So this is Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. But before we start reading the passage, I just want to give you a little bit of context. This passage starts right after Jesus had taken the disciples across the Sea of Galilee, and there was this huge storm that came over them, and Jesus calmed the storm, and he calmed the disciples as well in the process. And so they make it through the sea, and they land across the way, and this is where this story picks up. It says, "Then they arrived at the region of the Gerasenes, which is opposite of Galilee. As he stepped out on shore, a man from the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had not worn any clothes, and he did not live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him, shouting, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me.' For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, 'What is your name?' He said, 'Legion,' for many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. Now there, on the hillside, a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these swine, so he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd stampeded down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. When the swineherds and the herdsmen saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then the people came out to see what happened, and when they came to see Jesus, they found the man whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then the whole throng of people of the surrounding region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged that he might be with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, 'Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you.' So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, there is a lot in this story, right? It's a long story, and there is a lot going on within this story. And we only have about 20 minutes, so I'm going to try my best. I'm going to go really fast. I hope you had your coffee this morning. But for the sake of the series, I think this will make it a little easier for us. For the sake of the series, we're going to kind of act like mountaineers, and we're going to be looking for the mountains in this story. What are the mountains in this story? And if we ask that question, we'll find at least 4 mountains that were moved in this story. Mountain number 1, crossing the Sea of Galilee. Remember, I told you the story picks up after they had just crossed the sea and there was this crazy storm. Well, crossing the Sea of Galilee, the way that they did it was a really big deal because on one side of the Sea of Galilee, you have Jewish territory. And on the other side, you have Gentile occupied territory. And it was a big deal because you weren't supposed to cross from Jewish to Gentile side. And Jesus was a Jew taking his Jewish disciples from the Jewish territory to the Gentile territory, which was unclean. You didn't want to go to this place. For example, I thought of my dad. He went to University of Florida. And if I were to come home and tell him, I want to go to FSU for college, he wouldn't have had it, right? He would have been concerned. And it's okay, I know the Florida State people would say the same thing about UF, right? It goes back and forth, but this is kind of what's going on, but in a much deeper, more serious level. The Jews and the Gentiles don't mix, but Jesus goes anyways. Mountain number 2, Jesus goes near a cemetery. This demon-possessed man ran to Jesus from the tombs. And Jewish people were not supposed to be anywhere near the tombs, near the cemeteries. Pastor Joe told me that he went on a mission trip one time to the Navajo people. And when he went on that mission trip, their job was to clean up the cemetery. And they had to clean up the cemetery because the Navajo people could not go near the cemetery because they had unclean spirits there, and because of their religion, they felt like they could not go anywhere near the cemetery. And so Joe and the missionaries with him were there to clean the cemetery. And so that's what's going on here. It's no different. The Jewish people could not go near the cemetery because they would be unclean if they did. But Jesus goes anyways. Mountain number 3, Jesus interacts with an unclean man. This man not only has demons, which makes you unclean, but it says in the scriptures that he wasn't living in a house, he was living in the tombs. And to be very clear, he wasn't like living under a tree at a cemetery or something, but he was living in the burial. He was living, because they had these tombs where you rolled the stone over, right? And you buried people in there. He was living in the tombs. And rabbinic law was very clear that if you got anywhere near somebody who did something like that, you would be unclean as well. But Jesus goes anyways. Mountain number 4, Jesus interacts with pigs. Now, if you go on social media today, you'll see a lot of little baby pigs, right? It's like a kind of fun trend. Everybody wants to get a little baby pig and raise it, right? Well, for the Jewish people, this was not how it worked. The pigs were unclean. You could not be near the pigs. But Jesus, despite there being a bunch of pigs, he goes anyways. In other words, when the culture that Jesus is born into says, don't go across the sea to the Gentiles, don't go near a cemetery, don't go near anyone who's unclean, and don't go near any kind of unclean animals, especially not pigs, what does Jesus do? I think you got it by now. He goes anyways. Why would he do this? Well, because that's who Jesus is. We see this same thing over and over again in Scripture. The same reason he goes to the demon-possessed man is the same reason he goes to the Samaritan woman who was outcast from society, the first person that he preaches the gospel to. It's the same reason that he goes to the lepers and heals them, even though they're unclean people. It's the same reason that he heals on the Sabbath even though you're not supposed to do that. And it's the same reason that Jesus came into my life. As undeserving as I am to be used by a holy God, Jesus says to us, I will take a broken clay pot and I will fill it with a life that is made for something holy. This is why Jesus wants to be in our lives despite our mistakes and despite our failures and despite the sins of our past. Jesus wants to be with me and he wants to be with you. And he will move every mountain necessary to make that possible. But if you look closely at this story, you'll find that the mountain mover, Jesus, seems to leave one mountain left standing. And to see this mountain, we have to look at the Gentile people. In verse 27, we see that this demon-possessed man didn't always live in the tombs. It says he used to live in the city where all the Gentile people were from. It's like if a childhood friend of yours, that you grew up playing tag with and hanging out with, all of a sudden became really violent. Then they started threatening people, and then they started cursing at people, and they started hurting themselves and becoming depressed and all of this. And, this person you once grew up with was just somebody all of a sudden who just brought chaos into anyone who came near them. Well, the people saw this man fall apart in their city. And what did they do? Well, it tells us. They chained him up. They put guards around him. But the chains didn't work. The demon broke the chains off and he ran away into the wild, into the tomb. And I'm sure, as I was thinking about it, I'm sure the news came back. It's not that far away from their city. I'm sure the news came back that this man that these people grew up with was now living in the tombs. But I think the city considered him better off dead long before he even made it to the tombs. And now I think we can understand the rest of this story. Jesus goes to this outcast in society, and he heals him of his demons. And then where does he send the demons? This is where the story gets very interesting. Where does he send the demons? He sends the demons into the pigs, right? Sends them into the pigs, and they go off and die. Well, in the Gospel of Mark, it tells us how many pigs were sent off the cliff and died. Does anybody know how many pigs? I did some Bible trivia. Somebody actually knew in the first service. I was really surprised. But it says in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus sent 2,000 pigs off the cliff to die. And these pigs, it gets even worse. These pigs were not just wild pigs, That's one thing, Jesus, that's a little aggressive. But they were not just wild pigs. They were pigs that were used by these herdsmen. In other words, it was their economy. It was their entire economy, essentially. Jesus was not just killing some pigs. He destroyed the livelihood of a city. So they had to start from ground zero. And, I don't think you can read this story and not ask the question, why would Jesus do something like this? He could have sent them somewhere else. In fact, it says in the story that he could have sent them to what it says is the abyss. The demons say, don't send us to the abyss, which is kind of the place of hell where the demons go. They say, don't send us to the abyss, send us to these pigs. And the craziest part is that Jesus says, okay, I'll send you to the pigs. Why would Jesus agree to something like this? I think Jesus agreed because Jesus knew that there was one mountain left standing. Imagine you and your family have worked your whole life to raise up $500,000. That's a lot of money. You saved up $500,000 to help your family, to put your kids through school, and to do all these things. And then all of a sudden, some guy knocks on your door, and he says, listen, You remember that guy who grew up in your town who went crazy and threatened your family and got really violent and, did all this bad stuff? Well, anyways, there's some good news that there's this new medical procedure that he can actually be healed, but costs $500,000. And he asks you, would you be willing to heal this man? I think most of us would be like, no. I mean, let's be honest, right? Like if it was my son or my daughter or my mom or my dad, that's one thing, but to heal this guy who cursed at me and threatened my family and went crazy to give up my entire life savings for this one guy, I think most of us, if we're being honest, would rather leave that man in the tomb. This was the mountain that Jesus was pointing to. This was the mountain for the Gentile city. Because it says the people of the city begged Jesus to leave. They saw this man from their city be miraculously healed, but they couldn't see the goodness of God because of the mountain that was blocking their view. And last night I was struggling to really figure out what this mountain is. Like, what's the word? What exactly is this mountain? And I prayed, and I really felt like God was directing me towards the heart. I think the mountain that remained was the heart of stone within the Gentile people. And I think that Jesus casting these pigs into the sea was not Jesus being mean and telling them, oh, you worship money and all this stuff, and you don't care or any of these things. Jesus was not doing this just to be mean, just to curse them or whatever. I think this was Jesus' attempt at showing them the mountain of their brokenness. That's why when the man who was healed begged Jesus to go with him, and what does Jesus say? He says, no. He says, no. You have to go back to your city and preach the gospel. Well, I think Jesus would only say that if they hadn't known the gospel yet. The Gentile city saw the goodness of God with their eyes, but they did not believe it with their hearts. And this, I think, is Jesus pointing to the mountain in all of our lives, that we are all in need of healing. We all need the mountain mover who is Jesus. But a lot of us get caught up in life, right? We get caught up in life and we forget that we are not self-sufficient. We need Jesus to guide us and to be Lord over our lives. And it made me think of one of Aesop's fables. Fun fact, has anybody read Aesop's Fables? I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. So Aesop's Fables, really old book of stories. I purchased it years ago because I read that Martin Luther of the Reformation actually said, it's a quote, that next to the Bible, this is one of the best books that he's ever read, was Aesop's Fables. And he liked it so much that he actually wrote his own version of Aesop's Fables. But here's one of the stories that I think is relevant today. And just to give you some reference, this story is 2,600 years old. But I think that it carries today. It goes like this. The donkey and his shadow. A traveler had hired a donkey to carry him to a distant part of the country. The owner of the donkey went with the traveler, walking beside him to drive the donkey and point the way. The road led across a treeless plain where the sun beat down fiercely, so intense that the traveler decided to stop for a rest because it was so hot. And as there was no other shade to be found, the traveler sat down in the shadow of the donkey. Now the heat was also beating down on the owner of the donkey, as much as it was the traveler, and even more because he had been walking this whole time. So the owner, also wishing to rest in the shade of the donkey, he began to quarrel with the traveler, saying he had hired the donkey, but he didn't hire the shadow of the donkey. You got to pay extra for that. The two soon came to blows. They started throwing fists, and while they were fighting, the donkey took to its heels and ran away. And Aesop gives us this moral. He says, in quarreling about the shadow, we often lose the substance. The Gentile city, I think, was so focused on the loss of their livestock and the disruption of their way of life that they could not see the goodness of Jesus in healing this man. The Gentile city was so focused on this man who was possessed by demons and tormented and depressed that they didn't see their own brokenness as they chained him up, put guards around him, and let him go off to the tombs to die. They saw only the shadow and begged the substance, who is Jesus, to go away. But the man who was once possessed by demons now had something that the Gentile people didn't have. Because when Jesus tells him to go preach the gospel to these people who had just chained him up and put guards around him and sent him off to die in the tombs, when Jesus tells the Gerasene man to go preach the gospel to these people, he doesn't act like Jonah and run away and not do it right. He goes. The Gerasene man goes anyways. You know, there's only one mountain, I think, on earth that's taller than Mount Everest, and it is to love those who do evil to us. It's to love those who have beat us down. It's to love those who have cursed at us, to accept our true brokenness, allowing the grace for even our worst of enemies. But as we can see, the good news is that even this mountain can be moved through our faith in Jesus, as it was for the Gerasene man. So it is my prayer that we as a church might see our mountain of brokenness, because it is at that mountain of brokenness that our journey with Jesus begins. Amen.